Welcome to Peace from Health Anxiety. I am so excited that you're here. I do share a little bit of my story in the workshop recording. I think that's how I started. But before I get into the masterclass, I wanted to introduce myself. I'm Lily Seiss. You might know me from social media, or maybe you found me from somewhere else. And I'm a mom. I was a school psychologist for 14 years, and now I've been an anxiety coach and a three principles practitioner for 2.5 years. And health anxiety was something that I dealt with for a long time. I had no idea that that was its name. I mean, this used to be referred to as hypochondria, which was like had some negative connotations. But a lot of the time, I actually didn't feel like I was a hypochondriac. I felt like I knew a lot and I was appropriately worried, and other people just did not know as much as me. So, what my health anxiety looked like throughout the decades, I I just was definitely a more anxious kid and teenager and adult. And as a kid, I had headaches and stomach aches. You know what? I didn't really think too much about it as a kid. But in high school, I loved this TV show called ER, which is Emergency Room in the United States. And in ER, one of the characters, Mark Green, had, I think it was brain cancer. And I often had headaches. From the time I was a little girl, even before I could swallow a pill, I had headaches. And I don't know if it was before high school or it was after hearing that, I was like, oh my gosh, I could have brain cancer. I could have a brain tumor. I could have a brain aneurysm. I remember hearing about a brain aneurysm somewhere, and it was like, I thought if it was possible, it was probable. I was very influenced by TV shows, by movies, by hearing the news. It just like, it stuck with me. For other people, maybe they could hear it and it could flow. So I always had this deep fear that something would be wrong with my brain. And because I had headaches, that felt like it gave it some more weight. I also always, or not always, but very often had stomach aches. So that's how a lot of my anxiety manifested was stomach aches, headaches, and I thought maybe I have stomach cancer. So those would kind of just like be in the background during, high school. And then college too a little. I remember there was a friend of a friend who died of meningitis, and it just kind of got stuck in my head. And there was one Christmas time that I just was really worried. I had a sore neck. I had traveled from LA to Massachusetts, and I'm sure it was just like weird sleeping, but I'm sure I had looked up the symptoms of meningitis and I really thought I had it. And I was a little bit under the weather and it just escalated and I kind of couldn't get it out of my head, but I felt like it was really true. And I ended up going to the emergency room and it was like Christmas Eve. And they actually kept me for a little bit just because I was like so worked up and dehydrated, but I didn't have meningitis. As a younger adult too, I just did a lot of Googling and internet searches, just had like definitely like a more heightened sense of anxiety and a heightened sense of kind of like being vigilant about scanning my body. How is it doing? And then my health anxiety really went to the next level after the birth of my daughter. When she was around 2, I went to CrossFit, which is like an exercise place. Maybe you know CrossFit. I think it's usually kind of worldwide. And in the CrossFit that I was at, they kind of really pushed this paleo diet. This was right before the Whole30 and all of that stuff, but they had this mural on the wall and it was all about paleo. And I avoided learning about paleo because before I had already had an eating disorder. I had recovered from bulimia and restrictive eating when I was 19. So I was like, I don't want to take on any eating changes, but I kept seeing this mural and they would do a lot of challenges. I loved the community at CrossFit. Like that was so fun. They were always doing these like community things that involved diet. And so then I just kind of got into it. I did one challenge, I heard about it, and I got a book on paleo and I read it. And it was like, if you eliminate this and this and this, you can avoid physical and mental illness. Like that's how I read it. It was just like demonizing wheat and gluten and dairy and whatever, all those toxins and legumes. And I read it and my daughter was around 2. So I was like, wow, if I can feed her in this certain way, maybe she can avoid being sick. And they mentioned cancer, which was my big worry. I was like, oh my God, this makes so much sense. All these horrible things are responsible for cancer. So I did a very deep dive into paleo and primal. It was not just diet, it was whole life. It was, at one point, I was making my own cleaning products, my own beauty products. I was attempting to be zero waste, which means I really wanted to take it like recycling. Nothing. That was recycling, was not even great. I wanted to be able to fit all of my garbage into like a little mason jar. And I had already kind of gotten very worried about non-organic foods, toxins, plastic. And then it was like this next level, it was like worrying about the environment and that impact. And I couldn't do it half-assed. I was like all in, but it was really hard to kind of be social. Like I oftentimes just wanted to run away and live in the woods so I could feed everybody cleanly and live this clean life. And it seemed like there was so much out to get me. I also just like, I can really get hyper focused on things. And I was just so hyper focused on this natural kind of like clean living. I just listened to hours and hours and hours of podcasts. Mark Sisson, I think he's the one who started kind of primal living. And he had a podcast and I listened to every episode. And he came to speak at our CrossFit gym. And I remember he was there and answering questions. And I would guess like what he was going to say. And somebody asked about birth control, and I knew exactly what he was going to say. It didn't even apply to me because I had already lost my period because I was so anxious and so obsessed with health. I didn't get my period for 3 years. It had nothing to do with my weight. I was at like a normal, healthy weight. I was probably even a few pounds heavier than I am now. It was just the extreme stress that I put myself through with an unhealthy obsession with health food. It was just my whole life. I remember there was one time I'd kind of like recovered a little bit enough to get my period back and have my son, but then I kind of fell back into it because he had a lot of digestive troubles, and it was like, eliminate these foods. And I'm like, great, I'm just going to eat turkey and sweet potatoes. But we were in Palm Springs and we were in a pool, and there was a family and they also had a kid, and they had this strawberries, and they were not organic. I didn't know if they were washed, and they were kind of like they were getting wet by the pool, and I let my son eat them because what kind of did top my health worries was wanting to be socially appropriate. Like I didn't want to be, I've had a hard time kind of sticking to my guns around stuff. So I'm like letting him eat this strawberries. And I guess it also wasn't sticking to my guns. It was like I didn't want to give my kids food issues. I didn't. I'll finish this strawberry story and then I'll think of something else, or I thought of something else. But so my son, this like innocuous example, he was sitting and eating strawberries, so happy. And it inside was like I was tortured. Like my heart was aching, my stomach hurt. I honestly felt like I had heard like strawberries were the worst to be non-toxic. I didn't even know if they were washed. Like it just felt like danger, and I'm sure that was the message I was sending to my body. And I would see moms like letting their kids eat non-organic strawberries and Doritos, and I would wish that I could be as ignorant as them. That's how I felt. They probably weren't ignorant, because now I give my kids non-organic stuff and Doritos all the time. I know all that information, but I actually know what's really important. I know it's not just down to the food. But 5 years before that, when I was starting out all the paleo stuff, my daughter was in preschool, and I really wanted her to live a long, healthy life. And I felt like it was by avoiding certain things and eating very naturally. But I also knew it was really important for her to have an easy relationship with food and be social. And so I didn't want her to develop an eating disorder. So we'd go to these kids' birthday parties, and there would be like pizza and cake. And sometimes I would bring her her own cupcake. I made so much of my own stuff. But most of the time I just let her eat her own thing. But I felt like between a rock and a hard place, because I'd be seeing her eat pizza and it would be like my stomach would hurt so much. Like it just stripped out all the fun. I could go into a long thing, but you probably didn't come here to hear so much about orthorexia. But of course I did all the stuff of Googling anytime my kids were sick. And I could go on and on about orthorexia. If you want to hear more about orthorexia, email me and I'll tell you more, but I'll kind of keep it to health anxiety. So I knew that there was like sure that I had some anxiety around health. But I honestly, even when I recovered and I was able to get my period back and I recovered from orthorexia, I still was like more worried, but I never thought I had health anxiety. Again, that term wasn't used when I kind of recovered from it. But I really did think I know so much more than other people. If they had read everything that I read, like I felt like it was my job to worry. So it was there, but it just wasn't something I was really addressing because my big issues were driving anxiety and panic attacks. Also feared about losing my mind and all this stuff, but like those were the things that were really like make it hard for me to work. So I kept failing at like managing panic attacks, actually having freedom from panic attacks. I tried so much with driving anxiety. And then after another thing didn't work, I like went online and then I found the 3 principles, which is what I'm going to share with you, and so much more. I found Sari Taylor, who's now my friend and my colleague, and I started learning about human psychological functioning in a way that I never had. Never in graduate school as a school psychologist, never in all my years of therapy and all my retreats. Oh, and I went to so many. And it was fun. I met some great people. But I heard things, and they're not anything weird or new or groundbreaking, but I heard it in a different way. And through being in this conversation, my health anxiety fell away. So I had done a lot of work in terms kind of like demantling paleo and all of that stuff and making peace with my body. But I don't know, just went on behind the scenes, just gone. And I have no health anxiety. It doesn't mean that I don't have a worried health thought here and there, but I never, ever, ever would have thought that I can experience the peace that I can now. I have diabetes too. I was like a later in life diagnosis of type 1 diabetes. And my kids have gotten sick. There was a pandemic. I know that there still might be, there is a pandemic, but the lockdown, like when COVID, I never, ever would have thought that I could not have health anxiety during that time, but it never even came back. And so I just want to say there is so much hope. I was very obsessed with health, very obsessed with health. Even before I had kids, I had a dog and he had like a little, I don't know, a growth, and I would measure it. Oh, I used to keep headache diaries. Oh, I obsessed. I definitely had health anxiety, OCD, and I do not anymore. I'm a normal, carefree, loving mom. And I used to think that, here was careful, here was like, vigilant on top of it, me. The other end was like careless. And I did feel like some people might have, like they were careless. And so I had to be here. I would be the one to worry. Now I see you can be carefree. You can take great care of your health, great care of your loved one's health, and you can be carefree. And that is where I'm at. And that is what's possible for you, to go from health anxiety to health confidence, to maybe go from being like really, really careful to a little bit more carefree. So welcome. I'm really excited that you're here. I remembered another thing that I used to be very anxious about. And when I started becoming sexually active, I was a teenager, no judgment. I was so worried about contracting an STD, especially AIDS. So I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and AIDS seemed so, so scary. And so I really obsessively worried. Anytime I engaged in sexual activity, I just felt like I was going to get an STD. Again, it was kind of like that. If it's possible, it was probable. My biggest fear was getting AIDS. So I often would go and get tested for STDs and AIDS, and I would go by myself and just like wait, like freaking out, being like, I am dying. And the first time, okay, TMI, you're welcome to just skip over this if you don't want to. The first time I like gave a blowjob, I remember looking in my throat and then seeing lumps and just normal throat stuff. But I was like, what is this? I'm dying. Oh my gosh. So that was also a really big phase that I went through. Especially, I think, that can be complicated in terms of sometimes I wasn't like in a relationship. And so it would just be like hooking up. And I just had all this shame and all this worry that I was going to get AIDS and die. I don't think about that. It really also went away once I met my ex-husband. I was 20 and then kind of just was in a stable relationship, and that faded away. But it was a huge, like, I would when I'd have to wait, because this was when I would get tested, I was around like 17, and I would sometimes have to like wait a week. It was just like I already felt like I was dead. So I don't know if you experienced that, but if you do, hopefully you feel a little less alone.